Second wave feminism was a movement that began questioning women's rights in the 1960s. Feminists took a significant step further in the 1970s as their focus moved beyond basic rights and onto women's social roles in society. In response to this change in thinking, television shows such as Doctor Who assumed the responsibility of turning the role of the female character away from traditional gender stereotypes in order to appeal to their audiences. The recurring character of the companion in Doctor Who began to represent each generation of women and became a role model for women of her day, as well as a sign of an evolving society. First aired in 1963, Doctor Who is the longest-running sci-fi television show in history. Its latest episode, The Time of the Doctor, was eagerly watched by 8.3 million people. It has visibly influenced many of its viewers when the 11th Doctor, portrayed by Matt Smith, began wearing a bow tie as a part of his signature outfit. Bow tie sales increased as high as 94% across the world.
Bow ties are cool.
Throughout history, television has reflected as well as affected the way in which society moves as a whole. Doctor Who is no exception, particularly with the character of the female companion. The Doctor has always traveled with an assistant of sorts, the majority of them being women, and the first being Susan Foreman, played by Carol Ann Ford. One of my big hates about the part was the fact that Susan was constantly running into danger and screaming. We met goodness knows how many peculiar creatures, and I just don't think she would automatically have screamed. But I was told, no, you're a damsel in distress. They did put it into the script that Susan was the Doctor's equal, and she was even meant to be capable of flying the TARDIS, but I was never allowed to do more than flick the odd switch. Ford starred in Doctor Who the same year that Congress passed the American Equal Pay Act of 1963, near the beginning of second wave feminism. The general view regarding women when the movement first started was that they belonged in the home, a stereotype made popular by shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best.
You know, they say a woman's place is in the home, and I suppose as long as she's in the home, she might as well be in the kitchen.
At this point, the women's movement primarily focused on equality in the workplace. When it began to succeed in that area, it moved forward and gained a larger following. Doctor Who first aired with Susan Foreman when second wave feminism, which lasted until the early 80s, was just beginning. At this time, there was a formula to Doctor Who's characters. The Doctor deduced, the male companion was the action hero, and the female companion played the damsel in distress. This began with Susan and her two teachers, Barbara and Ian, who fulfilled those roles to a T. On a whole, companions served the purpose of having the technology of time travel explained to them. They became the bridge between the audience and the Doctor's world rather than fully fleshed out characters. The only way they related to their audience was their lack of understanding of time travel. The first Doctor, William Hartnell, often took a condescending tone with his companions, male or female, which makes it rather surprising that the first companion the Doctor respected, in some terms, was from a more underdeveloped time than any of the others. The characters Jamie and Victoria began traveling with the Doctor in 1967, 1 year after the National Organization for Women was launched. They both came from more primitive times, Jamie being a Highland warrior from 1746, and Victoria being the daughter of a scientist from the Victorian era. Jamie is often considered a fan-favorite companion, and was one of the first companions that served as almost an equal to the Doctor. This is quite ironic considering his knowledge of tech was even less than that of his predecessors. He also tended to have rather savage tendencies. It's not much of a surprise, though, that a male companion would be the first to make this jump to being a more respectable character, and less of a wall for the Doctor to bounce his thoughts off of. While Victoria was still, like her predecessors, a damsel in distress, she gradually became stronger as a character. This shift to a slightly stronger female companion occurred in the same year second wave feminism began moving forward, as more women's liberation groups began forming in America. Zoe Harriet entered the show after Jamie and Victoria. She, unlike the companions who came before her, was from the future. This time gap between companions and audience became a sign that there were enough fans of the show that the directors felt the technology didn't need constant explaining.
This is the most advanced machine. You have to count answer the questions.
Of course he can. The Doctor's almost as clever as I am.
Zoe was a mathematical genius with a photographic memory. Her intelligence even rivaled the Doctor's. In front of the camera, this was of course due to her being from the future. Behind the scenes, something much bigger was happening. Bring in the 70s, and with it, some showing signs of second-wave feminism, such as legalized abortions in 1973. The movement began in the 60s with Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which captured some of the frustrations women had of their limitations in society, but it really picked up and gained a larger audience in the 70s. Women in Britain had been involved in peace movements during the hippie era, and by the end of the 60s had shifted their focus to feminist causes. With the Equal Pay Act of 1970 in the United Kingdom, women could move on from equality laws to true equality within society. The passage of equality laws had laid the groundwork for feminists, and it was time for the next step, equal representation. The evolution of women's roles in society began to be portrayed within Doctor Who when the third regeneration of the Doctor started traveling with a new companion, Elizabeth Shaw, in 1970. A scientific advisor to another recurring character, the Brigadier, Liz was an expert in meteorites, physics, and medicine. She was much more assertive than the previous companions, and her background in the United Nations Intelligence Task Force, UNIT, helped her challenge society's expectations of a woman's intelligence. The connection between this drastic change of the companion character and the time in which it happened, in the midst of second-wave feminism, was shown more and more as Doctor Who progressed. Jo Grant, the next companion from 71 to 73, in some ways followed in Elizabeth's footsteps. She was also a UNIT operative, however she symbolized a different generational change than feminism. While still being the Doctor's assistant, she managed to become a teacher for him as well, helping the socially inept alien interact with people. She and the Doctor had a relationship similar to that of a frustrated child and parent separated by the times in which they lived. It's very likely that this was meant to reflect the dramatic differences between hippie youth and their parents, which had built up due to the younger generation's opposition to entering the Vietnam War in the late 60s. Elizabeth Shaw and Jo Grant both began to change the role of the companion as the show found ways for the character to represent larger movements and shifts in society in order to properly relate to their audience. The companion most commonly credited for revolutionizing the role of women in the show is Sarah Jane Smith, played by Elizabeth Sladen. She traveled with the Doctor from 1973 to 1976, having one of the longest runs of the show. A journalist who conned her way into UNIT, Sarah Jane became the standard against which other companions are compared, as stated by Toby Whitehouse, one of the writers of Doctor Who. Because she was a comic companion, and I think that she, more than any other before her, redefined the role of the companion. And there are elements of Sarah Jane Smith that you can see in every companion afterward down to Amy. She changed the companion from being a rather helpless hysteric to being a feisty, opinionated, strong equal to the Doctor. And at the time, that was quite an extraordinary thing to do. That was not the role the companion or women were meant to be playing. They were meant to be playing the victim. They were meant to be decoration. I think what Liz Sladen did with that character is quite extraordinary. We forget how revolutionary she was at the time. Witty, inquisitive, and a true challenge for the Doctor, Sarah Jane was a fully three-dimensional character, a symbol of women's growing independence. The next companion, Leela, took another interesting turn in character. While Sarah Jane could be compared to Liz Shaw in her intelligence, Leela could be considered a mirror of Jamie. Like Jamie, she was from a more primitive time period. And, like Jamie, she was prone to violence, always carrying a knife, and could easily defend herself. While this attribute was something none of the other characters had ever exhibited, she was also much more sexualized than any of her predecessors, tending to wear revealing clothing, taking a step from being domesticated to over-sexualized. However, the costume change didn't carry into any of the other companions, and by the time Doctor Who entered the 80s, the women of the show were constantly varying in their traits. From Romana, a Time Lord with intelligence truly equal to the Doctor, to Tegan, a simple waitress who was always skeptical of the Doctor and more than willing to voice her opinion, each of the companions had something new to offer. The classic Doctor Who series ended with the 8th Doctor and companion Grace Holloway appearing in only one film. Grace was the first companion to fall in love with the Doctor, and Hugh with her, adding yet another new dynamic to the companion character. The show was cancelled in 1989, and brought back in 2005 with the new 9th Doctor and companion, Rose Tyler. In an interview, Carol Ann Ford stated, "I am so jealous of the current companions. It started when I saw Billie Piper swinging on a rope. I'd have loved to have done that. The girls nowadays have it good. They're given proper, three-dimensional characters to play, and they have a wonderful time. They're allowed to be funny, they're allowed to be sexy, they're just allowed to be interesting people." Many of the actresses of Doctor Who today have a say in their own wardrobe. The characters are written three-dimensionally, a bridge for the audience to relate to them as people. Dating back to the 60s, Doctor Who was one of the first shows to assume the responsibility of portraying women in this way in order to appeal to a growing feminist population. Doctor Who, and television as a whole, still has a ways to go in terms of how women are portrayed, but it's come far since the days of the damsel in distress. It was because of strong female characters such as the companions that women have been able to gain better representation in television. Only time will tell how Doctor Who decides to continue evolving its companions in order to adapt to changes in the years to come.